What if a few random weird events you've had over the years, moments of missing time, a sense of flying, or other unexplainable occurrences, weren't so random after all? What if those strange experiences actually pointed to something larger? Something like a UFO abduction experience you can't quite recall, maybe? That's exactly what researchers like Bud Hopkins, David M. Jacobs, PhD, and Ron Westrom, PhD, sought to investigate through a series of three 1991 Roper polls surveys commissioned by the Bigelow Holding Company. The data from these polls, analyzed by John E. Mack, PhD of Harvard University, aimed not only to determine the prevalence of such phenomena, but also to identify individuals who may be suffering from the after effects of these experiences. People in need of compassionate, knowledgeable therapy to help them cope. The resulting UFO abduction syndrome report offered fascinating insights into the phenomenon, but included a sobering statement. Unfortunately, the therapist cannot promise the one thing that patients desire most, and that's the cessation of abductions. However, as we'll explore through Graham Hancock's hypothesis, reframing how and why these experiences happen can offer a new outlook, helping people make sense of what otherwise seems incomprehensible. From my perspective, these phenomena suggest a kind of giftedness, an evolutionary process intertwined with other psi characteristics, like telepathy, for instance. Stick with me and keep an open mind as we explore this wildly compelling topic, starting with some ancient history in today's 13th chapter of Quantum Story Time. Welcome back to Yellow Brick Road Rash. Today, we're continuing our exploration of Graham Hancock's work called Visionary, his revolutionary interpretation of early human rock and cave paintings, which we touched on in the last chapter. We discussed the role of shamanism in creating Ice Age cave art found in France and really all across Europe during the Upper Paleolithic period. But those works aren't humanity's only attempt at illustrating shamanic journeys. The Sand People, believed to be humanity's oldest continuous civilization, has also been painting their visions on rocks in southern Africa for as far back as 30,000 to 40,000 years. In fact, it's believed that all of humanity may have originated from this very tribe. And I think that's interesting, especially after reading about my own trace ancestry in the Congolese area of Africa from 23andMe. If you recall from the last chapter, we noted recurring features among prehistoric paintings, not only animals and therianthropes, but we see geometric shapes as well. Hancock speaks about these being a commonly recurring element in rock and cave art. He sees them as illustrative of features seen upon entering a trance state, which tracks with the umbrella scope of his narrative that what we are witnessing is ancient peoples sharing their trance journeys with others. But these symbols seem to transcend space and time, since Hancock, through his own personal experiences with ayahuasca, has seen similar geometric shapes in his own journeys. This does give credence to his hypothesis and is the reason for his participation in these ceremonies for reaching altered states. But I wanted to dig a little deeper into these geometric shapes. Randomly, I came across a TED Talk where Genevieve von Petzinger spoke about cataloging these symbols in an effort to understand their significance. I believe she came up with 32 recurring symbols across the painted caves of Europe. She believes they are significant because, unlike drawings of animals seen in their daily lives, perhaps these are graphic designs packed with symbolic meaning in and of themselves. A first written symbolic language, so to speak. Not that they didn't symbolize something in their natural world, but represented concepts more than just direct representation. For instance, several large dots in a row could mean the movement of the sun or moon across the sky. Dots are by far the most painted symbol. I don't think her work has to be seen as diametrically opposed to Hancock's either. Both are aiming to describe something perceived and then described through this abstract, cognitively complex act of painting. So, what is the wounded man then? We see iterations of the wounded man all across Europe as well. Theories abound regarding the significance of this human figure, painted among animals and geometric patterns. But since we're focusing on the idea that cave paintings represent shamans' altered state experiences, we're going to look at it from that angle. Altered states involve more than just visual phenomena. People also report sounds, smells, and bodily sensations, what's known as somatic experiences. These can include tingling, itching, crawling skin, and even pain. Historical shamanic accounts describe sensations of supernatural darts, or arrows penetrating the skin, or thorns pressing against the body. Hancock believes the wounded men are visual metaphors for these sensations. The drawings often have short lines intersecting the bodies in cave art and are often interpreted as spears, representing neuropsychological experiences during altered states. This imagery reminds me of depictions of Christ on the cross, which do carry a profound emotional charge. Just as Christ's suffering conveys spiritual transformation, the wounded men symbolize the shaman's painful journey towards rebirth. Shamans were believed to voyage more frequently into these altered states than other people in their community, making them skilled interpreters of these experiences. Hancock proposes that these figures depict the shaman's death and rebirth, the initiation necessary to become a healer. This initiatory experience often involved pain as a gateway to transformation. The Yakut tribe, for example, described the process as their limbs being removed, bones extracted, flesh scraped away, fluids drained, and eyes torn out. Essentially, the worst trauma imaginable. This symbolic dismemberment, experienced during a trance that lasted 3 to 7 days, left the initiate in a death like state of isolation, often within a cave. Sound familiar? It parallels Christ's time in the tomb. The Arunta people of Australia describe a cave spirit that throws a lance into the back of an initiate's neck, followed by a second lance that severs the head. The initiate is then carried deep into a cave, placed by a cool spring, and bathed in light filtering through an opening in the rock above. There are also accounts of supernatural surgeries, where crystals are implanted in the body or sacred stones are thrown at the initiate, symbolically replacing their organs to energize healing. In some cases, a snake is placed inside the brain and the nose is pierced with magical objects. Similar stories of magical surgery and implants appear in the Americas, depicted in their art as well. In every case, the initiate voluntarily surrenders to spiritual death in order to be reborn. The wounded man, therefore, is an initiating figure, and the caves where these experiences took place held special significance. Often described as portals, caves may have been seen by ancient people as womb like spaces, symbolizing rebirth, Every time caves come up, I think of Merlin in the Crystal Cave. Crystals were integral to the experience, amplifying altered states of consciousness. Hancock's hypothesis is that 30,000 to 50,000 years ago, humans discovered a previously untapped ability to enter altered states, experiences that they documented on cave walls, while plant medicines like psilocybin, belladonna, and datura were likely used. Shamans also entered these states through trance dance, breath work, fasting, and sensory deprivation. Spontaneous trance experience, our focus today, were especially significant. Footnote: psilocybin and other entheogens were probably discovered while foraging for food, as I've mentioned again in the previous podcast, and they were available during the Ice Age. But humans had used psilocybin specifically for hundreds of thousands of years. The real innovation here, though, was painting those visions. What fascinates me is how many trance accounts mention the sensation of being pulled into a vortex, sometimes with a grid like pattern on the surface. Anyone who's taken psilocybin knows that grid pattern. It's super cool to see, and it does raise many questions. Caves, with their vast chambers and flickering firelight, likely amplified these effects, or at the very least reminded people of that vortex. Hancock's hypothesis is that shamanic altered states acted as catalysts, sparking creativity and helping humans build stable, nurturing, and nonviolent societies that endured for 25,000 years. Can we get a little bit more of that, please? But he goes even further, asking whether these altered states connected humans with supernatural teachers, powerful entities capable of guiding and influencing people, offering an adaptive advantage to our ancestors. Yes, please. Could modern shamans be encountering the same entities? If so, maybe we should listen more closely to what they have to say. After all, they possess a fundamental understanding of phenomena that science still rejects. To gain firsthand insight, Hancock participated in an ayahuasca ceremony and reported encountering entities that felt undeniably real. He wondered whether our ancestors made a leap forward because these beings were teachers. The identical imagery he saw, matching that found on ancient cave walls, strengthened his belief that these entities exist on another level of reality, vibrating beyond our normal sensory perception. This aligns with Aldous Huxley's 1953 observation after taking mescaline. The brain functions as a reducing valve that literally filters out all information unnecessary for survival. Most people are unaware of this filtering process, but some, like spontaneous trancers, seem able to bypass it naturally, allowing a different kind of information to flow through. Could this quality also explain certain abilities found within the autistic population? In 1983, Albert Hoffman rephrased this idea, comparing the brain to a radio receiver tuned to a single wavelength. Though we only hear one station, we have the potential to pick up other frequencies, other levels of reality. Unless you're a spontaneous trancer, a person who can immediately go into an altered state without utilizing any tools to enter into it, accessing those frequencies typically requires plant medicines or other trance mechanisms. Rick Strassman's DMT studies in 2001 supported this idea, suggesting that DMT moves that dial, changing the channel of consciousness. Each psychedelic, he theorized, tunes us into a different wavelength, offering distinct experiences. Now, jumping ahead a bit, I recently watched a podcast featuring attorney Daniel Sheehan, and some of you may know him through the alien disclosure stuff going on. He recalled a 1968 lecture at Harvard. The professor, an expert in intellectual history, was asked to name the most important intellectual insight of his time. His answer: we are in the process of evolving into a new species, one with the full flowering of ESP, including telepathy, precognition, non local abilities. We're moving towards direct experiential awareness, immediate, undifferentiated consciousness that is infinite and eternal. Y'all, and this was in 1968. That's crazy. Sheehan believes we are now witnessing a quickening of this evolutionary process, and over the next few years, more and more people will begin to experience these expanded states of awareness. If that's true, it means we have a lot to learn from shamans and Eastern traditions, wisdom that modern science has overlooked for far too long. Throughout history, cultural perceptions have shaped how these experiences are understood, though. In the 1800s, mysterious aerial sightings might have been described as flying boats rather than UFOs. Either way, they are different ways of describing an archetypal pattern. Here we're back to archetypes. But is this universal library of archetypes only accessible in altered states of consciousness? This particular library? Whether spontaneous or during an NHI encounter or tripping on a psychedelic, trance dancing, maybe practicing breath work, sensory deprivation, starvation, or even for some, dream states could be a mechanism for an altered state. Also, NDEs, OBEs, etc. And if so, why is this ability seemingly embedded in our genetics? Could it be a key to humanity's evolutionary process, gradually awakening us to perceive beyond the limits of our perception? As Carl Jung suggested, all reality is grounded in a universal substrate, with our perception being only a holographic fragment. Tools like psilocybin are just allowing those of us who cannot trance spontaneously to perceive into the universal substrate, or at the very least outside of the physical universe into other deeper dimensions. So, how does the NHI abduction experience play into the equation? How are they aiding in our evolution? Hancock proposes some pretty crazy stuff. He believes that these entities could be attempting to evolve towards physical existence themselves, and they have always been doing that. Specifically, they're trying to reproduce with humans to that end. The so called hybrid breeding program, which has been in place for millennia, aims to create beings who can survive in both realms. So, helping themselves is helping us, is helping themselves. Though many early attempts resulted in weak or malformed offspring. Think about it. If these are the same entities seen in other realms, but known by different names, such as guides, angels, etc., and sidebar, remember how angels came down from heaven and took on beautiful human wives who then created giant offspring? Then maybe we can see how this has been going on for a very, very long time, if we're going to believe in the lore, any of it. So, circling back, what if those weird random events in your life weren't random at all? What if they were spontaneous glimpses beyond the veil of ordinary reality? Moments when you bypassed the brain's reducing valve and tuned into another level of existence. Maybe you're a spontaneous trancer. Maybe UFO abduction experiences and spontaneous trance states share more in common than we think. And maybe, just maybe, they are signs that we are actually evolving into something new, something more aware, more connected, and more capable of perceiving the hidden dimensions that have always surrounded us. Back to the Roper survey of 1991. Three polls aimed to determine how many U.S. citizens may have experienced abduction like phenomena. They asked five seemingly unrelated questions designed to avoid leading participants toward any specific conclusion. Number one, have you ever experienced sleep paralysis with a stranger present in the room? Number two, Have you ever experienced a significant period of lost time, 1 or more hours, with no explanation? Number 3, have you ever had the sensation of flying? Number 4, have you ever seen strange lights or orbs inside a room? And number 5, do you have any marks or scars you can't explain? These 5 questions were embedded among 6 other unrelated questions, and those who answered yes to 4 out of 5 of these target questions were classified as potential abductees, leading to an estimate that 2% of the population, roughly 1 in 50 people, may have had an abduction experience. Take that for what it's worth. For more details on the report, refer to that report, and I've got the link in the show notes. But what if these encounters aren't extraterrestrial in the physical sense? Graham Hancock suggests they might represent the same phenomenon depicted on ancient cave walls: altered states of consciousness, not spacefaring visitors. I'm kind of on board with that. Consider the parallels. Both shamans and abductees report sensations of floating, beams of light, and encounters with humanoid figures. Whether animals, fairies, owls, or the classic gray aliens with large eyes and heads. Betty and Barney Hill's famous 1961 abduction case, for instance, involved medical procedures reminiscent of those shamanic initiation rites, which often included bone counting to determine a candidate's readiness for shamanic healing. Similarly, abductees report their bones being examined or counted. Regression hypnosis has revealed patterns of multiple abduction experiences beginning in childhood, many beginning in the late 1940s. Ironically, or maybe not so ironically, shortly after the infamous Roswell incident of 1947. Could these encounters represent interactions with the spirit world that intersects with our physical reality? The common themes are too numerous to dismiss as mere coincidence. Ultimately, whether these encounters stem from spirits, aliens, or interdimensional beings, they seem to be accelerating human evolution towards greater awareness of the infinite. And that can never be a bad thing, right? Like caterpillars becoming butterflies, we may be shedding our physical limitations to explore realms beyond the material. And we may need to be able to do this in the coming years. Perhaps this isn't forbidden knowledge either. It's our birthright, waiting to be unlocked as we awaken to the full potential of consciousness. There is no doubt that since the middle of the 20th century, our civilization has been moving towards a deeper understanding of consciousness and its intersection with spirituality. Quantum physics is beginning to offer glimpses into how these concepts might be connected. Consider those upper Paleolithic people. Anatomically modern humans underwent a sudden transformation into vibrant, creative, and spiritually aware beings. This knowledge was too important to be confined to the shamans alone. Their role was to share it and help others evolve. And what can we learn from that? Now let's take a moment and explore fairy lore. Jacques Vallée suggests that fairies occupy a space between aliens and spirits, acting as catalysts in early Western culture. I'll focus on 2 aspects: changelings and dance rings. According to folklore, fairies would steal healthy human babies and replace them with their own frail offspring. Graham Hancock supports Vallée's theory, proposing that this tale might reflect an early stage of that hybridization program I was talking about. But back then, they were having more failures than successes. The fairies would change out the ugly and weak fairy baby for the vital one. I presume the one they take back with them would become part of the breeding program in the context of the hybrid discussion. While this hypothesis is intriguing, it's also possible the changeling story arose as a way to explain genetic anomalies, possibly due to incest, providing a socially acceptable narrative for families. I can see that. The second piece of lore involves fairy rings, circles where fairies danced feverishly at night, often punishing humans who witnessed their rituals. Hancock speculates that this dance induced a trance, opening a portal through which fairies could move between realms. The secrecy was both to guard their method and to protect humans from being accidentally pulled through the vortex, through the portal. Still, could this story have also been used to explain the disappearance of unwanted children in times of hardship? It's a grim thought, but not inconceivable. Interestingly, unlike fairy lore, alien abduction reports rarely involve permanent disappearance. Hancock attributes this to advancements in their hybridization process, suggesting aliens no longer need to keep humans indefinitely. And I would say that's a good thing. I want to point out that there are experiencers who are creating some amazing art of their own here in these modern times. The work of David Huggins stands out to me. A link to his work will be in the show notes. And I'm sure there's plenty of other people out there doing it. I just couldn't sift through all the work to make sure I was covering people who had actually had abductions. What can we learn from his and others' creations, though? Now, let's briefly tie this back to The Wizard of Oz. The hero's journey aligns closely with the shamanic experience, as I've said many times before, filled with trials and transformations. Dorothy, like a human stumbling into a fairy ring, is swept into a vortex, the tornado, and she lands in another realm where time moves differently. While the citizens of Oz don't seem like traditional fae, their vibrant world and Dorothy's sudden arrival through that vortex evoke fairyland imagery. Could the feverish activity of the Emerald City be creating a hyper vortex like energy, similar to the fairy dance circles? I mean, look at the leprechaun green going on in there. Crazy. What is he trying to say with that green? And what of the Wicked Witch? Could she represent a force from outside even the realm of Oz itself, acting as a teacher complete with terrifying spears and flying monkeys, driving Dorothy toward her own awakening as a shamanic figure? In the end, anything is possible. So, what do you think? Do these connections resonate with you? Share your thoughts in the comments or please reach out to me on Discord via Patreon. I would love to hear your perspective. Thanks for joining us today. Ciao.